Well, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, Governor Corbett this past week released his budget. It's in fact $29.4 billion. Well, what a show. We have the Secretary of the Budget, Charles Zogby, on the program. He's perhaps the architect of it, or I'll say, other than the governor, the most influential voice in the budget. And then we'll get a Democratic response from State Senator Rob Teplitz. Stay with us. You're going to love this program.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Welcome back to the program. Well, we're fortunate to have the Secretary of the Budget, Charles Zogby. He's been on the program before. Thanks, Mr. Secretary, you come on. We appreciate it. You've got all the insight on this. Let's start with the broad view, first of all. Crafting the budget with not arguably a big deficit, yet the need to do more spending in certain programs. Go over the 3 or 4 driving forces or motives or aspirations in this budget, if you will.
Well, as you said, Terry, it's a $29.4 billion spending plan. And really the core of the budget is the governor's Building a Stronger Pennsylvania plan, recognizing coming out of the Great Recession, Pennsylvania was staggering. Our economy is stalled. Last 3 years, under the governor's leadership, 138,000 private sector jobs created. We brought our budget under control, stabilized it, 3 on-time balanced budgets without raising taxes on Pennsylvania families. We've gotten our debt under control. We're tackling legacy challenges like upgrades to our transportation infrastructure. And this budget, I think, represents a real pivot point for the governor, that he's accomplished these things around the budget, that this year we're able to make significant new investments in growing family-sustaining jobs, enhancing the quality of our public schools to raise student achievement, and then Healthy Pennsylvania, which is the governor's plan to expand access to quality, affordable health care for all Pennsylvanians. All
right, let's talk a couple, without getting too much in the weeds, let's talk about a couple. One of the points of reconciliation has to be, but now looks like a deficit, and you've talked about that before, 1.2 to 1.4 billion. States, you're proposing to spend something in the order of 3.3, you'll correct, believe me, you'll be able to correct me, 3.3%.
It's a 3.3% increase over the current fiscal year, 13-14.
Okay, that's correct. All right, now, how do you reconcile the spending and the deficit? What are the ways in which you propose to fund that?
Sure.
I guess that's the big question.
And when I talked about in my mid-year review last year about a deficit, that's our planning deficit. So we look at the cost of growth in DPW, medical assistance programs, our pension programs, slated to grow by over $600 million without any change in policy. So in this budget, you see the governor's Healthy Pennsylvania plan, for instance, which is going to save the Commonwealth $125 million with reforms to a broken Medicaid system. The governor put on the table and called on the General Assembly to enact meaningful pension reform. And we have savings in this budget predicated on pension reform, making long-term savings with a new plan design that allow us to make some savings in our pension contributions in the near term. So it's things like that that the governor has focused on that allows us to balance this budget without raising taxes on Pennsylvania families.
All right. I mean, one of the things that I know you've been pushing Health and Human Services to grant you the waiver to do your program, Healthy PA. By the way, I've polled on both Healthy PA and Medicaid expansion. They're both popular in the state. In fact, the governor's plan is more popular than the expansion in a poll that polls that I've done. But the one question is, if you don't get that approval, I mean, that leaves you with a hole in the budget, right? I mean, then what's your
Sure,
plan?
it complicates our challenges going forward. You know, but the fact is, Terry, in every budget that any governor presents, much less Governor Corbett, there's always things that need to be done, whether it's enactment of laws, changes by the General Assembly, or in this case, approval of a Medicaid waiver by the federal government. We've been in discussions. Secretary Macrath of DPW has been negotiating with the Department of Health and Human Services at a federal level. We've made a lot of progress in those discussions. They've not signed off on the bottom line, as it were, but we're going to continue to advance those, and we think we can get these changes enacted. We've got a 1/1/15 implementation date, so we have some room here.
All right, before I want to turn to the education. Well, I'll do that in the second segment. Let's just stay on the revenues just for a moment. Also, when we talk about the pensions, there are a variety of ideas in the legislature. Sounded to me like the governor was open to a lot of different suggestions should the legislature pass them. So this savings that you're going to call for a reduced employer contribution rate
Yes.
next year in both the teachers for school districts and for the state, that ultimately builds greater cost into the pension system, which you hope, and you can fill in the blanks, will be taken care of in a pension, quote, reform that you hope the legislature. Is that the premise on which this is based?
That's the same calculus, Terry, that the General Assembly used in 2010 when they passed Act 120. You're right. If we put less into our pension systems this coming year and did nothing else, it would be a longer-term cost. But the governor is working with the General Assembly to try to find the sweet spot, if you will, for a meaningful reform plan that's going to lower state and local school district costs by billions of dollars over the next 30 years. So we want to take some of those savings and use them to offset the near-term deferrals that we're proposing in this budget, with a net savings to taxpayers at the end of the day.
All right, let's run to a quick break. When we come back, one of the keystones, I think, of this budget are increased spending in education, and as the Secretary points out in the Ready to Learn program, talk a little bit about that and what the Corbett administration wants to do with education initiatives, and we'll do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation, educating citizens and business leaders about important public policy issues and civic affairs. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by BetterSaferRoads.com. To voice your support for safer highways and less traffic congestion, visit BetterSaferRoads.com. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Hey, welcome back to the program. I'm with Charles Zogby. He's the Secretary of the Budget. Coming up later in the program is State Senator Rob Teplitz. We'll call it the Democratic response. Mr. Secretary, one of the highlights, I think, and perhaps the most looked at, examined, and commented on aspect was the increase in education. After some flat funding and debates about whether you've increased or decreased spending, we went through all that. Right. With no need to revisit that. There's these not new programs, but expenditures in some, and there are a couple of new programs. Yes. I think. What's the purpose behind this?
Sure. Well, making new investments in our public schools and our young people. The fact is, Terry, despite what the critics might charge, this governor has put more into public schools, public education, each and every year. We had 2 years of decline in the prior administration. We've now had 4 years of increases under Governor Corbett. With the governor's new budget proposal, we're going to reach $10.12 billion direct state support of our public schools. That's the highest in our state's history. $1.55 billion increase since the governor took office. The centerpiece of the governor's budget proposal is a $241 million Ready to Learn block grant. These are going to be monies to schools focused on our youngest learners, making sure that they're ready to read, ready to do math. The building blocks of academic success for their academic careers. We've got an additional $20 million for special education, the first increase in special education in 6 years, $10 million for hybrid learning, which blends new technology learning tools with traditional classroom instruction. So we've got a lot of exciting initiatives, again, focused on our kids and ensuring that they've got the supports to succeed, to achieve in school.
as I listened to the responses, from school superintendents and others in the education, most of them, thought this was a good idea. Great, there are initiatives they can support. One of the concerns they had was sort of flat funding into the basic education subsidy. What's the premise behind?
Well, the basic education funding line item is the single largest line item in our budget in support of public schools. The governor's increased that in prior years. This year he decided to go in a different direction, believing that targeted resources, targeted investments, again, focused on expanding best practices, focused on evidence-based approaches that are going to raise the likelihood, again, that our kids are able to read, able to do math at grade level, felt that these were more important investments than the basic education subsidy. Again, we've made investments in other areas of public education, but the governor felt that this Ready to Learn initiative was just the most important thing that we could do this year, again, to raise the quality of our public schools across the Commonwealth.
Looking ahead, there's all kinds of activities about raising new revenues. I'm going to ask Senator Teplitz about this as well. Keno is one. I finally understand what Keno is. I had an explanation of how it actually works. You got Keno, internet gaming. Is the governor on board for those expansions? I mean, basically, I know you haven't seen the
with respect
details.
to Keno, we do have an assumption of Keno implementation in our budget, about another $20 million in revenue.
Okay.
The governor is not looking at this point to internet gaming. I know there's members of the General Assembly who are interested in that. But, this is about our lottery, keeping it stable, keeping the revenue growth in pace with the increases in eligibility that we're seeing, as well as cost increase. We know both of those are going up, but we know that our revenues aren't keeping pace for important senior programs. So Keno is a way to ensure that our lottery is there for the growing number of seniors who want to take advantage and access these important programs.
But the governor is still not in support of two taxes that often get mentioned. One would be cigars and smokeless tobacco, and the other is a severance tax on the amount of cubic feet, natural gas that comes out. Other than the tax, that were really a tax, but new expansion of gaming, which brings in revenue. There's no other taxes in this but increase.
We're generating new revenues in this budget, but one thing the governor isn't doing in this budget, Terry, is raising taxes on Pennsylvania families and businesses. The severance, people talk about the severance tax around Marcellus Shale. This April, we're going to see now $600 million in revenue that's been raised through the impact fee. And the reality is that money's going out to local communities for Pennsylvania communities to decide how to spend it, not coming into Harrisburg to have Harrisburg politicians dole it out. And I think that's the real difference. We are raising money from the Marcellus Shale activity, but again, it's going out to our communities, not to feed the spending beast in Harrisburg.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming on. Unfortunately, a half-hour program. The Secretary and I could probably do this for a couple of days. We could get into the minutiae. We always appreciate him coming in. All right, we'll get a response from Democratic State Senator Rob Teplitz. He'll be on in a moment, and we'll probably get the other side of the picture here. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Joining me is State Senator Rob Teplitz. He's a Democrat, obviously. We're here to, what we try to get is a variety of views. All right, you heard the Secretary. Obviously, you were in the chamber and heard the governor in the House chamber and have had some time to react. Overall, let me start with the broad question. Overall, how would you characterize this budget?
Overall, I'd characterize it as an election year deathbed conversion, but one that doesn't go far enough and one that's funded by a variety of budgetary gimmicks.
Okay. I heard gimmick a lot out of the response from, your party when they were doing the interviews, gimmick. All right, well, let's just start going through some of the specifics, and I want to get your point of view out. I asked the Secretary about the revenue side of it, $1.2 billion deficit, and he proposes to spend 3.3% more. So that looks like about $2 billion to me. And he's talking about these various ways to get $2 billion. What's your concern about that?
Well, they do a lot of one-time fund transfers. They take money out of the lottery fund. They take money out of the tobacco settlement fund. They kick the can further and harder down the road on pensions. So none of these are good long-term. And then what they have been steadfastly refusing to do is enter into Medicaid expansion under federal health care reform, which could save about $500 million and insure 500,000 Pennsylvanians. So
is your point that you think this is just sort of a series of one-time funding streams that go away that are going to leave the state? Finish my thought.
I think this is a budget that is trying to placate voters in an election year by giving lip service to some of the items like education, social services, and others that they've been criticized for the last 3 years, rightfully so in my mind, but without having a long-term sustainable funding plan to continue those programs.
One of the things that I asked the Secretary about, and I think a lot of when I read the papers around the state getting sort of the responses from the superintendents and other organizations, they're not unhappy about the grants, but the Ready to Learn, $20 million in special ed, that's obviously something that's good. But they were concerned about no new monies, and I asked Secretary that in the regular subsidy that they get, which means all the other costs, there's inflation, are not picked up. How big a concern is that to you?
It's a very big concern because of what I consider to be the devastating funding cuts to public education over the last 3 years under this administration. Now they put some money into a new block grant program, but that doesn't help all students. When the details of that block grant program came out, it appeared to me and to others that it really rewards wealthier districts with students that are already succeeding as opposed to helping the districts that have the greatest need, which is where we should invest our money. So, I think it's a nice thing for them to unveil a new program and talk about education. I'm glad that we're finally talking about education with this administration, but I don't think they're doing it in the right way. They're not helping all students.
Do you think you and I shouldn't ask you, to talk for your caucus. You never ask a political leader to speak for another political leader. You get on dangerous ground doing that. But from your point of view, if they had put more money, let's say they had increased the basic subsidy, what each school district get, but let's say by 3-4%, would you have been far more acceptable than to the other educational dollars? Is that really what the problem is?
We need to have more equitable funding of education, more stable funding, more fair, open, transparent, fiscally responsible, and doing gimmicks and adding new programs and adding new block grants, even ones that have targeted investments, that doesn't get to helping all students, and that's where we need to get as a state.
Let's talk a bit. I asked him about some taxes. I noticed that over the course of the last couple of weeks in particular, not all, but many Democrats have talked about smokeless cigar and tobacco tax. They've talked about severance tax. What do you think is overall, what do you think about raising money in that way? Well, let me go earlier. Are you going to vote for Keno?
I'm not sure. I have a lot of concerns about Keno. I'm on the Senate Finance Committee. We've had 2 hearings on the lottery, one of them recently based on Keno. I'm concerned that in less than 10 years, we've gone from no legalized gambling other than the lottery to slot machines, table games, small games of chance, and now there's talk about Keno. And what I'm particularly concerned about in the budget address was a determination by the governor to introduce more gambling and more alcohol into our communities, but without giving sick kids the medical marijuana that they need to address concerns that those families have.
We're going to run to a quick break. When we come back, I may ask the Senator about medical marijuana and where he thinks that's going and some other aspects of the budget. We'll do that in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Hey, welcome back to the program with State Senator Rob Teplitz. Senator, one of the things is recreational marijuana, still not popular in the state. Medical marijuana, very popular. What's your sense about that?
Well, I would support, and I am a co-sponsor of a bill to legalize medical marijuana under strict regulation, under supervision of a doctor, to help families, particularly sick kids who are not helped, who undergo hundreds of seizures a day that research has shown could help. That's as far as I would go. I would not go towards legalization or decriminalization.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I didn't hear a lot about, and you represent the city of Harrisburg, so we'll talk about cities and maybe use Harrisburg in particular. How does cities fare? But if you want to focus on your city, which I'm sure you've paid a lot more attention to for obvious reasons.
I'm concerned about how cities fare under the budget. There's an early intervention program that tries to stay ahead of financial challenges that cities face. That's been cut. The city of Harrisburg, has been well documented, the challenges we have. It appears that the money that we were successful in putting in the budget last year for reimbursement for the fire and emergency services that the city provides to the Capitol complex, that's in the budget. But again, I don't feel that we should have to go begging for that money every year. That's why I have a bill to make that permanent, because it's a service the city provides the Capitol, and the state should pay for it.
Well, and not arguably, cities have a lot of property, owned by, nonprofits and, churches and all. And nobody begrudges them that, but that just creates an unusually difficult property tax. Before I let you go, last year, no doubt about it, the Senate was much more bipartisan when it got to the budget, when it got to passing the extent, doing Medicaid. Do you see that bipartisanship still underway?
I hope so. I hope so.
As we get down to this budget, hearings start. You've been a lot more bipartisan. I've actually been impressed by the way, not on everything, but a lot more collegiality, right?
Well, yeah, and I think we need to recognize the governor's budget proposal is just that. It's a proposal. It's the start of a process.
Good point. Look, as always, you're always welcome. Secretary Zogby's always welcome. We get 2 different points of view. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.